Wind Waker is one of my favourite Zelda games, but the last time I played, I kept thinking about its rushed production. In particular, I kept thinking about the 2 dungeons that had to be cut. Eiji Aonuma said that while he considered reinstating these dungeons for the Wii U port, he couldn't because they'd already been used in other games, so technically they no longer exist. I kept thinking about these missing dungeons. What items would you have found? What puzzles would have utilised them? What role did they play in the story? And where did they ultimately end up? Wind Waker's missing dungeons are very much the lost city of Atlantis to the Zelda fandom, so I thought it would be fun to try and solve this mystery. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we're doing a theory video. Or at least a hypothesis based on circumstantial evidence. Hence the acronym, ABOSS. But before we dive in, some information gathering was necessary. As another narrowboat captain once said,
real treasure hunters always start by doing some detective work.
The first thing I wanted to do was narrow down which games the dungeons could have been reused in. So I made a list of all the games released between the original GameCube version of Wind Waker and the Wii U port. I then eliminated the ones least likely to have inherited the dungeons. The 4 Swords games were developed by Capcom, so it's unlikely that they would have had access to leftover assets and maps from the previous Nintendo-developed Zeldas. So this eliminates Minish Cap, 4 Swords, and 4 Swords Adventures. So that narrows our search down to 4 games: Twilight Princess, Phantom Hourglass, Spirit Tracks, and Skyward Sword. The next step in the investigation was to make note of the items that Link finds in Wind Waker, develop a chart of items not found in the game's remaining dungeons, and make note of their equivalent in the other games. In this way, I could use the items as my point of reference. From here, I developed my hypothesis on the 2 dungeons. First, we'll discuss the one that most people have figured out, Jabun's belly. It's well documented that Lord Jabun has unused audio files in the game's data, one in which he seems to be groaning in pain, and another in which he seems to be laughing. These voice clips imply that Jabun was in some kind of trouble, and that Link needed to help him in order to acquire Nehru's Pearl. I believe that Ganon somehow infected Jabun with some kind of an illness, as he did to Jabu Jabu in Ocarina of Time, and Link would have had to go inside Jabun's belly to cure him. This could explain why this dungeon was cut, as the scenario was just a rehash of what happened in Ocarina of Time. Now that we have an idea of what this dungeon contributed to the game's plot, let's discuss what mechanics it would have used. As I said earlier, my point of reference was Link's items cross-referenced against their equivalent in other Zelda games. As Jabun's belly would likely have been water-themed, I believe the key item in this dungeon would have been the iron boots. It's unlikely to have been the bum bag, as the ruins of Great Fish Isle have a stone slab with a near identical pattern to the slab guarding Jabun's hiding place on Outset Island. This implies that if the dungeon did originally take place on this island, you would have still needed to get the bombs from Windfall Island in order to gain access to the dungeon. Another set of iron boots is found in Twilight Princess. It's given to Link by the mayor of Ordon Village, used to gain access to and navigate the Goron Mines. But Wind Waker already has a fire-themed dungeon in Act 1, so the Goron Mines can't possibly be recycled from Jabun's belly, can they? Well, not the entire dungeon, but as you explore the volcano, you will come across something you wouldn't expect to find in a fire-based dungeon. Rooms full of water. Some of these reservoirs have switches on the bottom, which you need to use the iron boots to activate. Now, I am aware of a problem with this hypothesis. Wind Waker didn't allow you to explore below the surface of the water. However, this might not always have been the case. Data miners who've looked deeper into the game's files have found test rooms with pools full of clear water and depth levels on the walls. The presence of the test rooms seems to imply that the development staff were at least considering mechanics that allowed Link to explore underwater. These water chambers in the Goron Mines could have been intended for the second half of Jabun's belly. But what about the first half of the dungeon? Well, there is another water-themed dungeon that stands out to me, the Ancient Cistern from Skyward Sword. I still have no idea if I'm pronouncing that word properly. Cistern? Cristern? I don't know. The key item needed to finish this dungeon is the whip. You use it to swing across pits, grab items from enemies, and latch onto things, very similar to Wind Waker's grappling hook, which you got in the previous dungeon on Dragon Roost Island. There's also the dungeon's underground catacombs. One of the structures you'll find here is a chamber with a large demonic head. However, the teeth of this creature grow very far back into the head. It also looks suspiciously round and smooth. Is it possible that we're not actually on the outside of a creature's mouth looking in, but were originally intended to be on the inside looking out? I believe that this cave was originally intended to be the inside of Jabun's mouth. One last thing to mention is the dungeon's boss, Koloktos. It's the only part of Skyward Sword where you can actually pick up the enemy's weapons, a mechanic that Wind Waker was well known for. So, could Koloktos have originally been a boss intended for Wind Waker? So, now that we have an idea of what the first of these two missing dungeons would have been, let's move on to the second one. For this next dungeon, I had a good long think about what role it would have played in the story. Starting with Link to the Past, the Zelda games followed a certain formula. Link would collect a set of 3 MacGuffins representing forest, fire, and water. I wonder if that's where they got the idea for the Pokemon type triangle. Anyway, Link would use these MacGuffins to get to the Master Sword at the end of the game's first act. Then there'd be some grandiose revelations before Link is sent to gather another set of MacGuffins in the second act. But Wind Waker deviates from this formula. Once you approach Great Fish Isle, you find to your horror that Ganon has already destroyed the entire island. It is possible that this was intended to shock players and spice up the formula somewhat, but it doesn't really match Ganon's MO. His usual methods are blackmail and intimidation, as is the case with the Great Deku Tree, the Gorons, and Jabu Jabu in Ocarina of Time, as well as with Valoo in Wind Waker. I think that originally there would have been a civilization on this island who worshipped Jabun, but they were relocated during the game's development when the dungeon was cut. Note that Medli's tunic has the design of a Zora sapphire, which comes from the symbol of Nehru, the goddess of wisdom, while Valoo's treasure is Din's pearl, the goddess of power. Medli is also the attendant who brings Valoo his meals, just as Ruto did for Jabu Jabu in Ocarina of Time. So, why do the descendants of Zora now worship Valoo instead of Jabun? In the Hyrule Historia, there is concept art of an unused stovepipe island in which a volcano is visible. I believe that this would have been a spiritual successor to Death Mountain from Ocarina of Time, as the artwork shows a character that's clearly an elderly Goron. Gorons do still exist in Wind Waker, serving as travelling merchants, but without a designated home island. The Fire Dungeon itself does have statues of creatures who vaguely resemble Gorons, or possibly evolved Gorons who now look like the Pokemon Nosepass. I believe that the Rito civilization was developed before the Goron civilization, and the Fire Dungeon was developed before work could begin on the Rito's actual dungeon. So due to time constraints, the Fire Dungeon was moved to the Rito's Island, while Stovepipe Island and the Rito's real dungeon, Jabun's Belly, was scrapped. Now, the reason I'm on this tangent is quite simple. I believe that if Jabun, the third guardian deity, had a third dungeon, and was attached to a third civilization, there would have been a third sage. Wind Waker's second act has Link visit 2 dungeons with the intention of appointing 2 new sages to perform a sacred song and restore power to the Master Sword. The song that the 2 sages play is very clearly the song you hear on the title screen. You can clearly hear a violin and a string instrument, but you will notice that there's nobody to play a wind instrument. I believe the original concept was for the 3 new sages to play 3 parts of a complete song, much like the Song of the Hero in Skyward Sword. The concept art for Stovepipe Island shows a Goron holding a pipe with text that reads, "Everyone loves tobacco." Is it possible that this tobacco pipe actually doubled as a flute? It would make sense for the third sage to be a Goron, as they could continue the land, sea, and air theme of Link's transformations in Majora's Mask. I think the Goron Sage's temple would have been the Temple of Earth, and Medli's temple was originally intended to be the Temple of Sea, but it was changed to Earth to fit as a duo with the Temple of Wind. Well, at least that explains their bizarre logic of having a bird as the Sage of Earth and a plant as the Sage of Wind. Anyway, now that I've explained my hypothesis for this dungeon's contribution to the game's narrative, let's discuss the possible key items and puzzles. Going back to our chart of items, the 2 possible candidates are the hammer and the power bracelet. Now, the hammer is particularly interesting because, while it is technically found in a dungeon, the second assault on Forsaken Fortress, the obstacles that require the hammer to bypass them seem a bit out of place here. You use the hammer to push down barriers that weren't there before, so I think the hammer and switches actually came from our missing Act 2 dungeon, and what's more, I have an idea as to where the rest of the dungeon went. Twilight Princess expands the Temple of Time into a full dungeon. Its key item is the Dominion Rod, which allows Link to take control of statues, very much like a streamlined version of a command melody from Wind Waker. One of the statues you can control are these giant sentinels holding hammers that you control to smash through gates. So, how is a Goron like a hammer? Breaking things. I think that the parts of this dungeon where you had to control the statue from a distance could have originally been parts of the Wind Waker dungeon, where the Goron sage would have needed to break through an obstacle when he and Link had to split up. In addition, Switching back and forth between Link and a Goron companion was later revisited in Phantom Hourglass. The Goron Temple has Link accompanied by the son of the Goron Chief. He can curl up into a ball to destroy boulders, much like Link's Goron Mask transformation in Majora's Mask. It draws parallels to how you needed to control Medley and Makara in the other dungeons. One last thing I'd like to mention is the hammer found in Phantom Hourglass's Temple of Muto. It works differently to other hammers in the series, floating above Link's head and is able to hit enemies from a distance, but it's also used to trigger seesaws that propel Link onto higher platforms. Since your Goron companion jumps into the air to destroy rocks, it's possible that in Wind Waker he could have helped Link by jumping onto these seesaws, much like how the Gorons in Twilight Princess curl up to propel Link onto higher platforms. So, to summarise, I think the missing dungeons were Jabun's Belly, which would have utilised the iron boots and had its rooms reused in Twilight Princess's Goron Mine and Skyward Sword's ancient cistern. The second dungeon would have been a Temple of Earth, in which a Goron sage would have accompanied you. Its key item was the hammer, and its puzzles were salvaged for Twilight Princess's Temple of Time, Phantom Hourglass's Goron Temple, and the Temple of Muto. So, is this the actual fate of the missing dungeons? I honestly don't know. One confounding variable is that we don't know how far into development these dungeons were before they were shelved. It's unlikely that leftover assets from Wind Waker could have been reused in the DS games because of the hardware limitations, and the fact that the DS Zelda games use the overhead view instead of a 3D perspective. But if all they had were the blueprints for the dungeon, then they could have been reused anywhere. I've used logic and reasoning to put together a hypothesis, but the only way we'll ever know for sure is if someone who worked on all of these games comes forward and tells the fans the real story. Until then, it's just a hypothesis based on circumstantial evidence, which, while not guaranteed to be correct, is still fun to speculate, as well as being a good title for a web series. So, that was my theory about Wind Waker's missing dungeons. Did you agree or disagree with my deduction? Let me know your own ideas about the missing dungeons in the comments below. Cheerio!